So, Ben, far be it from us to give any parameters around whether people can start or stop, right? So, 64, okay, good question. But I guess if someone was wanting to contemplate investing at 64, there's a few things that they need to consider that we want to spell out here, Ben, because not only we're at the latter part of the life cycle, Ben,
Mm.
but it's all about how much time before we want to see the fruits of our labour. So there's a whole range of things. So let's riff off some stuff here.
There is, and in terms of sitting on the plane and going through some of those notes, I do want to say that starting at the age of 64 would be unusual, generally speaking, if we were going to take on some debt. So we don't know the full story here, but starting at 64, I would certainly want to know what all my options are available to me, not only directly with property, but also through some other investments. So it's not impossible. But is it the right strategy is very much a question mark. So here's some of the things that I sort of made notes of before we get into some of the sort of nice list we've got going on here, Bryce, as well. So step number one is just always work backwards from what your needs are. Okay, so from retirement, what are your needs? What are the essential things that you need to cover, and that is your baseline. All right. So ultimately, if you're 64 and you're thinking, here's the minimum requirements of what my life needs to look like for the next 20, 30 or so years, that's your baseline. Then you can add to that what your wants are. Okay, well, if my needs are taken care of, that's my baseline. What extra do I want on top of that in terms of that? Now, once you then starting to document those types of things, you then want to start to say, okay, well, now that I've put those things together, how feasible is what I'm talking about? How realistic is it in terms of my current net position? And I'm thinking about income, I'm thinking about cash flow, and I'm thinking about current asset position. And that's going to be different for every 64-year-old or thereabouts in terms of what their story is. So that's why it's always a case by case basis, and we'll never give specific personal advice. And then it's about the realization of that feasibility and that plausibility of whether it can happen, and that's all part of what you need to be putting into the mix in terms of because if you're working back from those points of view, then you then start saying, so well, how can I achieve that? And I achieve that just through getting someone to help me land my plane with my super and doing a transition to retirement super plan, getting some annuities as part of my share portfolio, some bonds, some regular yield incomes from some share. All of those could be real, but also direct private rental properties could also be part of that mix as well. But that's why I think it's got to be all cards on the table, working from that sort of personal position backwards in terms of what's available to you. Because what are some of the things, Bryce, that you've got to think about?
Yeah, because I think you've set the scene beautifully there. But it's like, well, what are my liquidity needs during this time from 64 going forward? So you have to have a real sense of how would I rate my health and wellness at this point of time, and how long am I actually going to be earning a working income for? Do I plan on getting towards the end of that working income, or am I planning on digging in for another 10, 15 years, right? So that's important. What is, the amount of super that you have and your cash flow needs? What is your risk tolerance? Because
Yeah.
definitely one of the things that we love about property, Ben, is and we've showcased it in webinars, we've showcased it in trying to do it via audio on this podcast, is we love the 30-year journey, because what it does is at the beginning of the 30-year journey, you've got a price that you pay for a property or a share or whatever you're analyzing over the 30 years. And then at the end of that 30 years, there's been significant growth. We can apply a compounding growth to it. We can go, wow, aren't we delighted we stayed in the game for 30 years? But what is irrefutable and undeniable is during that 30 years, there are periods of volatility, right? So at age of 64, your tolerance for volatility is limited. You market cycle timing. Imagine if you were 64 and started investing in Perth a decade ago, you would have been 74 before you started to see the run that you're just experiencing now
Yeah.
over in Perth. So market cycle timing is really, really important. So I So again, it's at the top. Far be it for us to say whether you can or can't build a property portfolio, but you didn't ask the question, Ralph, should I buy an investment property? You asked, can I build a property portfolio? Which, to our assumptions that we're projecting onto this question, is that means multiple properties, and so that therefore comes down to how long are you in the game, how much income, working income, what is your risk tolerance, what do you feel about market cycle timing, how do you self-assess your health and wellness health and wellness right now, what cash flow needs do you need in the short little while, because that's going to very much determine what your liquidity needs are. And if you circle back to Ben's opening, probably not the default suggestion for someone at 64. Has someone done it? Yes. Is it possible for someone who's 64 to do it? Absolutely, right? No ceilings here. But is it typical? No, it's not.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that we talk about access to funding and lending. We definitely know that from a responsible lending obligation through your investment savvy broker, there will be some lenders who will not have comfort in potentially lending over a 25 or a 30-year period. Especially, they're going to know, how are you going to service this mortgage? So there are definitely some funders out there who have an appetite for being able to borrow to older people. But again, there would need to be, a really strong mitigation or evidence-based part of the application process, where you'd be sort of saying, how am I going to ultimately repay this loan, and talking through that particular process with your lender, so they can also get comfort that it's appropriate if you're going to do some leverage. And I would, as I said for the earlier example for Richard, we don't want to see people getting into very, very high leverage positions later in life. We would like to see that loan to value ratio story moving south, not north. So that's why it's not impossible, and it would probably be more unique than the norm in terms of whether we would eventually say that there's justification to be able to build this. But if you turn up to me and say, I've just sold a business and I've just sold it for $5 million, and I want to put $4 of that million into a property portfolio, which is a recent story that we had in the business, last week actually. And so people do sell businesses, different age groups and so forth in that particular example. But that's the type of example where we could say, okay, well, yeah, could you get 20, 25% borrowings against the rental income and the other monies that are going to be stored in long-term passive income vehicles to be able to justify a 25% loan to value ratio? Our consensus on that, when I spoke to the broking team, was, yeah, we think that's plausible, and we don't think that that's unreasonable, especially because there was a little bit more than 5 million in their scenario as well. But that just gives you some example of the different stories where everyone just naturally assumes, do I go into a leveraged property position at 64? Well, no, that would be
that's the point, isn't it? You and I, someone might have a fistful of cash. Ralph might have a fistful of cash and happy to
big
pay.
Inheritances are coming through at that age. Remember, we're also talking about $2 to $3 trillion. Well, I think it's 2.5 to $3 trillion worth of generational wealth that's also going to be passed down. So if those family members are in their 90s passing away, there's going to be this enormous amount. And that next generation aren't passing it on to the Gen Ys. So the baby boomers potentially want to allocate that. So building a property portfolio based off that inheritance allocation, that's not a dumb thing. And, in that particular case, you'd be sort of saying, well, without any debt or a very, very low amount of debt, that's actually quite a smart passive income strategy.
And I think back to Tom in our summer series, Ben, who started late and built a significant property portfolio. So it's kind of a shout out. Let's crowdsource it. If you're listening to this and you are either someone who started at 50 or later, or you know someone who has started at 50 or later and is willing to come and share their story, can you please definitely let us know? We get a lot of questions from a lot of folks asking about what they perceive as a later starting time. So if we can showcase other people who've done it, Ben, so that these people can draw inspiration if they're starting the investing game a little bit later in the life cycle, we'd certainly love to do that. So I'd like to crowdsource it, folks. If you know someone, if you are someone who has actually started 50 plus, definitely please reach out to us at the Property Couch. Just go to thepropertycouch.com.au, leave us a little note. We will definitely reach out and showcase them on our podcast because we'd love to do it. We'd love to be inspired by these people who are outliers, Ben,
Yeah.
so that people can see how they can also be an outlier as well. So great question. Thank you, Ralph. Hopefully that's helped the folks here. But there's just a few things that you need to think about when you're starting a bit later, and hopefully that's helped.